Democracy depends on a free press. Please support our independent journalism at democracynow.org/give. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Leaders in Europe held an emergency summit in London Sunday, 2 days after an unprecedented clash at the White House between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and both President Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance. Zelensky had traveled to the White House to sign a deal giving the United States partial control over Ukraine's raw earth minerals. But the deal imploded following a dramatic televised Oval Office meeting where Trump accused Zelensky of gambling with World War III after Zelensky insisted Ukraine could only back a Russia peace deal if it included security guarantees from the United States. The news conference ended with Trump and J.D. Vance openly criticizing Zelensky.
You're not in a good position. You don't have the cards right now. With us, you start having cards. Right now, you don't. Yeah, you're playing cards. You're playing cards. You're gambling with the lives of millions of people. You're gambling with World War III. You're gambling with World War III. And what you're doing is very disrespectful to the country, this country. That's back to you. Far more than a lot of people said they should have.
Have you said thank you once?
A lot of times.
No, in this entire meeting, you said thank you.
Even today.
You went to Pennsylvania and campaigned for the opposition in October. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country.
Shortly after this exchange, Secretary of State Marco Rubio and National Security Advisor Mike Waltz asked Zelensky to leave the White House. Trump's treatment of Zelensky shocked many in Washington and around the world. Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski said, quote, "I'm sick to my stomach as the administration appears to be walking away from our allies and embracing Putin, a threat to democracy and U.S. values around the world," unquote. Meanwhile, House Speaker Mike Johnson suggested Zelensky may need to step down following the White House meeting. After leaving Washington, Zelensky traveled to London to meet on Saturday with British Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who warmly greeted Zelensky outside 10 Downing Street. On Sunday, Starmer hosted an emergency meeting of European leaders. He called for a coalition of the willing to be formed to support Ukraine if a peace deal is reached.
We will go further to develop a coalition of the willing to defend a deal in Ukraine and to guarantee the peace. The UK is prepared to back this with boots on the ground and planes in the air. Together with others, Europe must do the heavy lifting. But to support peace in our continent and to succeed, this effort must have strong US backing.
Meanwhile, France is pushing for a one-month truce between Russia and Ukraine. While almost all of Europe is backing Ukraine, Hungary's authoritarian leader Viktor Orban praised Trump, saying, quote, "Strong men make peace, weak men make war." President Trump stood bravely for peace, even if it was difficult for many to digest, Orban said. In other fallout from the White House meeting, a major Norwegian fuel supplier, Haltbach Bunkers, has announced it's halting fuel sales to U.S. ships. The company said, quote, "Today we witnessed the biggest disgrace ever put on display by the current U.S. president and his vice president," unquote. In other news on U.S.-Russian relations, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has ordered U.S. Cyber Command to suspend offensive cyber operations targeting Russia. The Pentagon has not publicly discussed the policy change, but National Security Advisor Mike Waltz told CNN the United States would use, quote, "all kinds of carrots and sticks to get this war to an end," unquote. Meanwhile, on Sunday, Russian state television aired an interview with Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov talking about Trump. He said, quote, "The new administration is rapidly changing all foreign policy configurations. This largely aligns with our vision," unquote. On Friday, a member of Russia's state-owned news agency, TASS, gained access to the Oval Office during the clash between Zelensky and President Trump, while reporters from the Associated Press and Reuters were excluded. The White House said the Russian reporter was not approved and was eventually removed. The United Nations and many Arab nations have condemned Israel for cutting off all food and humanitarian aid into Gaza. Egypt and Qatar accused Israel of using starvation as a weapon of war. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu announced the blockade as Israel attempts to pressure Hamas to agree to a new proposal by the United States that would force Hamas to release all remaining hostages without Israel fully withdrawing from Gaza. Hamas has accused Israel of trying to derail the original ceasefire agreement. Over the past 2 days, Israeli troops have killed at least 9 Palestinians in Gaza. Residents in Gaza denounce the new Israeli blockade.
Suffering will increase after the occupation's decision to close the crossings. Frankly, since the beginning of the war, they have been trying to starve us, and we fear the people will starve due to the lack of aid and food supplies. Additionally, people are afraid of the return of war and facing death again. Isn't it enough that the occupation has killed 50 or 60,000 murdered so far?
The Trump administration is fast-tracking another $4 billion in weapons to Israel, including more than 35,000 2,000-pound bombs, as well as 4,000 Predator warheads. Secretary of State Marco Rubio signed an emergency declaration that bypasses Congress to expedite the arms shipment. The Trump administration has approved $12 billion in arms for Israel over the past 5 weeks. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres is urging the Trump administration to reverse its sweeping cuts to international humanitarian programs, saying it'll make the world less healthy, less safe, and less prosperous.
The consequences will be especially devastating for vulnerable people around the world.
South Africa is one nation that could be particularly hard hit by Trump's foreign aid cuts. An official at the Desmond Tutu HIV Center is warning the funding cuts to HIV projects could lead to 500,000 deaths in South Africa over the next 10 years. Meanwhile, an advisor to the Elizabeth Glaser Pediatric AIDS Foundation said Trump's halt to foreign aid amounts to a, quote, death sentence for mothers and children, unquote. In related news, a high-ranking official at USAID has been placed on leave after warning in a memo that the administration has failed to protect programs that deliver life-saving assistance despite a promise of waivers by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. Nick Enrich, USAID's acting assistant administrator for global health, had written a memo, quote, this will no doubt result in preventable death, destabilization, and threats to national security on a massive scale, unquote. In other Trump news, federal judge Amy Berman Jackson has ruled the head of a key government watchdog was illegally fired. The ruling centered on Trump's firing of Hampton Dellinger, the head of the Office of Special Counsel, which handles whistleblower complaints. In her ruling, Judge Berman Jackson warned against giving Trump a, quote, constitutional license to bully officials in the executive branch into doing his will, unquote. In other legal news, the Democratic National Committee and related groups have sued Trump over his attempt to strip the bipartisan Federal Election Commission of its independence. In immigration news, the Washington Post is reporting the Department of Homeland Security has asked the IRS to hand over detailed information on about 700,000 suspected undocumented immigrants, including their home addresses, phone numbers, and email addresses. According to the Washington Post, the Internal Revenue Service initially refused the request, but the agency's new acting commissioner is reportedly exploring how to comply. Federal law bars the IRS from sharing personal tax information with other government agencies. Meanwhile, President Trump has signed an executive order designating English as the official language of the United States. The move comes weeks after the White House took down the Spanish language version of the official White House website. In Illinois, a jury found landlord Joseph Zuba guilty of murder and hate crimes for killing 6-year-old Palestinian-American child Wadi Al-Fayyoumi and wounding his mother, Hanan Shaheen, in October of 2023 in the town of Plainfield. He now faces life in prison without parole. After the verdict was announced, Wadi Al-Fayyoumi's father, Ode Al-Fayyoumi, spoke at a news conference, his words translated by CARE Chicago's executive director, Ahmed Rehab.
For me as a father, I feel like I'm discovering Wadia and learning about Wadia more every day. And suffice for me as a father to know that his pride in being who he was as a Palestinian, as a Muslim, as an Arab, and being killed and targeted for that was sufficient for him to live through, even though it caused his death. And that, for me, I will always remember him with pride.
Here in New York, former Governor Andrew Cuomo has announced he's running for New York City mayor. This comes 3 years after Cuomo was forced to resign as governor in the wake of 11 accusations of sexual misconduct. Cuomo was also found by a New York ethics board to have improperly used state funds to write his coronavirus pandemic memoir and has been accused of deliberately underreporting and covering up the number of nursing home deaths during the pandemic. Cuomo joins a crowded field ahead of the Democratic primary June 24th as calls grow for New York City Mayor Eric Adams to resign. Adams has been widely accused of accepting a quid pro quo from the White House to enact Trump's immigration crackdown in exchange for the Justice Department pushing for Adams' corruption charges to be dropped. In other news from New York, another prisoner has died. An unnamed 22-year-old at the Mid-State Correctional Facility near Utica was pronounced dead on Saturday. 9 fellow prisoners said the deceased was brutally beaten by prison officers. This comes 2 days after a prison guard union reached a tentative deal with New York Governor Kathy Hochul to end a wildcat strike that started 2 weeks ago. The deal suspended parts of the HALT Act, which limits the use of solitary confinement. 2 other prisoners died during the strike. Iowa's Republican Governor Kim Reynolds signed into law a bill ending civil rights protections based on gender identity, becoming the first state to repeal civil rights protections for transgender people. Last week, protesters flooded the Iowa Capitol in Des Moines to defend trans rights as lawmakers voted to curtail them. Protesters lined the streets of Waitsfield, Vermont, as Vice President J.D. Vance arrived for a ski vacation at the Sugarbush Resort this weekend. Protesters held signs expressing anger at the Trump-Vance administration over everything from its attacks on trans rights, the climate, and Palestinian rights, as well as the pair's treatment of Ukrainian President Zelensky and its mass firing of federal workers. Vance and his family reportedly had to move their stay to an undisclosed location because of the demonstrations. Several protests were also held at Sugarbush Resort. Protests targeting Elon Musk also took place over the weekend. In New York, 9 people were arrested as they demonstrated outside a Tesla dealership. Rallies also took place in front of Tesla retailers in Jacksonville, Florida, Tucson, Arizona, and other cities as protesters held signs reading messages like "No dictators in the USA." In Los Angeles, hundreds demonstrated at the SpaceX facility in Hawthorne. SpaceX has received billions of dollars in government funding and has been apparently trying to take over a $2.4 billion Federal Aviation Administration contract that had already been awarded to Verizon. Meanwhile, thousands gathered at national parks across the country to condemn the firings of at least 1,000 National Park Service workers and to defend public lands. In New York City, hundreds gathered outside the United Nations headquarters Saturday, demanding the Trump administration cancel next week's huge military drills known as Freedom Shield on the Korean Peninsula.
My name's Neon. I'm with Nodotol for Korean Community Development, and I'm here today alongside thousands of Koreans and their allies in the U.S. to declare an end to the U.S.-led Freedom Shield war exercises and to demand an end of U.S. taxpayer dollars to fund endless war in Korea. The Korean War has not ended. We're still at a ceasefire, just like in Palestine, except for Korean history has told us 75 years later, the U.S. is still in our homeland. It's still dividing Korea. So we need to demand a complete end to ceaseless war provocations and war games.
South Korea is the site of Camp Humphreys, the world's largest overseas U.S. military installation. And the Oscars were held Sunday evening. History was made in the Best Documentary category.
And the Oscar goes to No Other Land.
The Palestinian-Israeli film No Other Land won for Best Documentary. The film follows the struggles of Palestinians in the occupied West Bank community of Masafer Yatta. to stay on their land amidst violent attacks by Israeli settlers aimed at expelling them. The film was made by a team of Palestinian-Israeli filmmakers, including the Palestinian journalist Bassel Adra, who lives in Masafer Yatta, and the Israeli journalist Yuval Abraham. They both spoke at the ceremony, beginning with Bassel Adra, who became the first Palestinian filmmaker to win an Oscar.
Thank you to the Academy for the award. It's such a big honor for the four of us, and everybody supported us for this documentary. About 2 months ago, I became a father, and my hope to my daughter that she will not have to live the same life I'm living now, always fearing settlers' violence, home demolitions, and forest spill displacements that my community, Masafer Yatta, is living and facing every day under the Israeli occupation. No other land reflects the harsh reality that we have been enduring for decades and still persist as we call on the world to take serious actions to stop the injustice and to stop the ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people.
We made this film, Palestinians and Israelis, because together our voices are stronger. We see each other. The atrocious destruction of Gaza and its people, which must end. The Israeli hostages brutally taken in the crime of October 7th, which must be freed. When I look at Bassel, I see my brother, but we are unequal. We live in a regime where I am free under civilian law, and Bassel is under military laws that destroy his life and he cannot control. There is a different path, a political solution without ethnic supremacy, with national rights for both of our people. And I have to say, as I am here, the foreign policy in this country is helping to block this path. And, you know, why? Can't you see that we are intertwined? That my people can be truly safe if Bassel's people are truly free and safe? There is another way. It's not too late for life, for the living. There is no other way. Thank you.
Israeli filmmaker Yuval Abraham and Palestinian filmmaker Bassel Adra, co-directors of No Other Land, which just won the Oscar for Best Documentary. Visit democracynow.org to see our interviews with both of them. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. Democracy Now! Is funded by viewers like you. Please give today at democracynow.org/give.